Battle of the Bulge is remembered as America's greatest victory in Europe. It is described as a heroic stand at Bastogne and a masterstroke by General Patton. But the truth is far more complicated. What began in December 1944 was not a triumph. It was a near disaster, one born out of Allied complacency and intelligence failures. By the end, the United States Army had suffered nearly 90,000 casualties in just 6 weeks, more than in Normandy, more than in any other battle of the war. To call it a clean victory ignores the reality that this was also the bloodiest, costliest fight the Americans ever endured in Europe. The Germans called it Wacht am Rhein, the Watch on the Rhine. Hitler saw it as his last chance to turn the war. His plan was ambitious: smash through the Ardennes, cross the Meuse, capture Antwerp, and split the British and American armies apart. Even his own generals doubted it could succeed. They warned of shortages of fuel, of exhausted men, of tanks that would grind to a halt in the snow. Hitler overruled them. What is remarkable is not that Hitler planned an offensive, but that the Allies never believed he could do it. They considered the Ardennes a quiet sector manned by inexperienced and tired US divisions. Reports of German troop movements were dismissed as defensive shuffling. Even decrypted intelligence pointing to German preparations was brushed aside. Eisenhower's staff assumed Germany was too weak, too broken, to launch another major attack. They were wrong. On December 16, 1944, over 200,000 German troops, supported by nearly 1,000 tanks and assault guns, slammed into the American lines. Entire regiments were overrun in hours. Towns like Clairvaux and Saint-Vite fell after desperate resistance. Within days, a vast bulge appeared on Allied maps, the deepest German penetration in the West since 1940. This is where the legend of the Bulge begins. But before we celebrate Bastogne or Patton's march, we need to ask, how did the Allies, with all their intelligence, air power, and resources, allow themselves to be caught completely off guard? And can a battle that killed nearly 90,000 Americans really be called a victory? The German attack on December 16th was overwhelming. At first light, the US positions in the Ardennes collapsed under a massive artillery barrage, followed by armored spearheads and waves of infantry. Many of the American divisions holding the line were either inexperienced or exhausted from previous fighting. They were not expecting a major assault, and they were spread thin across a wide sector. In the northern sector, Sepp Dietrich's 6th Panzer Army drove directly into the American lines. Units of the 99th and 106th Infantry Divisions were hit with such force that within days thousands of men had surrendered. 2 entire regiments of the 106th were encircled and forced to lay down their arms, one of the largest American mass surrenders of the war. Further south, General Hasso von Manteuffel's 5th Panzer Army advanced with greater success. In towns such as Clairvaux, small American units fought desperately, but their resistance only delayed the inevitable. The Germans moved with a speed that shocked Allied commanders. Eisenhower himself admitted that the first week of the offensive was a German victory, plain and simple. The scale of the collapse cannot be ignored. In the first 3 days, the German salient expanded rapidly. American supply depots were captured. Fuel dumps desperately needed by German armor were seized intact. Panic spread as rumors circulated that German paratroopers and even commandos in American uniforms were operating behind the lines, which, in some cases, was true. What is rarely acknowledged is how unprepared the Americans were. Many soldiers had been assured they were in a quiet sector. Some units had no minefields, no strong defensive lines, and no expectation of facing panzer divisions. When the assault came, retreat was often the only option. For the families of the soldiers, the news was grim. Within the first week, American losses exceeded 30,000 men killed, wounded, or captured. The public at home was not told the full truth. The official story emphasized stubborn resistance, not the chaos that marked the early days. The collapse of the front also created moral controversies that remain debated. At Malmedy, Waffen-SS troops massacred dozens of American prisoners. At the same time, stories circulated of American units executing German captives in retaliation. War crimes were committed on both sides, fueled by the desperation and brutality of the fighting. The Ardennes offensive was not initially a heroic defense. It was a rout, a shock that exposed the fragility of Allied confidence. The Germans had achieved what few thought possible. They had broken through the Western Front, humiliated the U.S. Army, and bought themselves a brief but undeniable success. As the German advance widened, one small town came to dominate the story of the entire battle: Bastogne. Strategically, it mattered because 7 key roads converged there. Whoever held Bastogne could control movement across the central Ardennes. For the Germans, it was a useful objective. For the Americans, it became a rallying point. When German forces encircled Bastogne, the 101st Airborne Division, along with elements of the 10th Armored, dug in to resist. Supplies were scarce. Ammunition, food, and winter clothing ran dangerously low. The situation was dire enough that when German envoys demanded surrender, Acting Commander Brigadier General Anthony McAuliffe issued his now famous one-word reply: nuts. This moment is celebrated in American memory as proof of indomitable spirit, but the truth is more complex. The Germans never concentrated their full strength on reducing Bastogne. Their main effort remained fixed on reaching the Meuse River. Bastogne was significant, but it was not the decisive objective of the offensive. The legend that Bastogne stopped the German advance oversimplifies the reality. What stopped the German advance was fuel shortages, overstretched supply lines, and increasing Allied reinforcements across the front. Even within the U.S. Army, the myth of Bastogne was encouraged for morale. It provided a clean story of defiance at a time when the larger picture was grim. Units had been overrun, thousands captured, and the front had buckled. Bastogne offered a symbol that the American public could grasp, a reminder that not everyone had broken under the pressure. None of this diminishes the courage of the men inside the perimeter. They endured frostbite, constant shelling, and shortages that should have made resistance impossible. Their stand was real. What is controversial is how much weight has been given to it in the broader history of the battle. The German offensive did not fail because of Bastogne alone. It failed because the Wehrmacht lacked the fuel to sustain momentum, because Allied air power returned once the weather cleared, and because American reinforcements eventually arrived in overwhelming numbers. Bastogne was one part of this larger story, not the sole turning point, but the symbol that lived on. Few moments in the Battle of the Bulge are celebrated as much as General George S. Patton's sudden pivot north to relieve Bastogne. In American memory, it is portrayed as a feat of unmatched brilliance. A general who turned his army 90 degrees in the middle of winter and smashed into the German flank. But does the reputation match the reality? Patton's Third Army had been preparing contingency plans for weeks. His staff had already drafted scenarios to wheel north in the event of a German breakthrough. When the Ardennes erupted, he did not improvise from scratch. He executed a plan that was already in place. That is good generalship, but it is not the miracle often described. Moreover, Patton's relief of Bastogne was made possible by conditions beyond his control. The weather cleared, which allowed Allied air forces to hammer German supply lines and provide desperately needed airdrops to the 101st Airborne. German fuel shortages meant that panzer divisions were slowing down even before Patton arrived. The Wehrmacht's offensive was already losing momentum. not because of Patton's brilliance alone, but because it was logistically unsustainable. The Third Army's attack was also costly. Progress was slow, the roads were clogged with snow and ice, and the fighting to break into Bastogne took heavy casualties. Patton's men fought hard, but their success came as much from Allied material superiority as from tactical genius. The US Army had endless trucks, gasoline, and ammunition. The Germans were scraping the bottom of the barrel. This does not mean Patton deserves no credit. His determination and energy were real, and his leadership gave confidence at a time when panic was spreading. But to suggest that he single-handedly saved the Allies at Bastogne oversimplifies the situation. The Germans had already failed strategically by overreaching. Patton's role accelerated their defeat, but it was not the sole reason for it. The controversy lies in memory. In post-war narratives, especially American ones, Patton's counterattack is often described as the decisive stroke of the battle. The truth is more nuanced. Patton was effective, but Germany was collapsing from its own weaknesses. The US Army's victory was as much about numbers, logistics, and overwhelming resources as it was about individual brilliance. When people speak of the Battle of the Bulge as a victory, they often forget the price paid. It was not just another offensive repelled, it was the bloodiest battle fought by the United States Army in World War II. Between December 1944 and January 1945, nearly 90,000 Americans were killed, wounded, or captured. That figure is higher than the Normandy landings and campaign combined. German losses were of a similar scale, with about 100,000 casualties. But for Germany, those numbers were fatal. The Wehrmacht could not replace men, tanks, or fuel. For the United States, the losses were staggering, but reserves still existed. On the ground, the human suffering was severe. Soldiers endured freezing temperatures with inadequate winter clothing. Frostbite claimed as many as 15,000 American casualties. Entire units spent days without proper food or shelter. Prisoners of war faced brutal conditions. At Malmedy, over 80 captured Americans were executed by Waffen-SS troops. In retaliation, American units committed their own atrocities against German prisoners. The battle became a grim cycle of reprisal and survival. Civilians in the Ardennes suffered as well. Villages were destroyed, families driven into the snow, homes looted by both armies. For many Belgian and Luxembourg villagers, the winter of 1944-45 meant displacement, starvation, and the trauma of being trapped between advancing forces. The language of victory becomes harder to accept when set against this cost. The United States Army emerged standing, but at a price higher than any other battle it fought in Europe. For many families back home, the Bulge was not a story of triumph, but of telegrams and funerals. The controversy here is simple. Can a battle that inflicted nearly 90,000 casualties on the US Army be celebrated as its greatest victory? Or was it in fact the greatest blunder of the Allied High Command, a disaster barely contained, remembered today only because of how dangerous it could have become? The Battle of the Bulge ended in January 1945 with the German offensive crushed. Hitler's gamble had failed. The Wehrmacht lost men, tanks, and fuel it could never replace. From that moment onward, Germany was on the defensive until its final collapse in May. For the Allies, the Ardennes was proof that even in desperation, Germany could still inflict staggering losses. Yet the way the battle is remembered differs sharply from the way it was fought. In the United States, the story became one of defiance at Bastogne, Patton's brilliance, and eventual victory. These elements are true in part, but they overshadowed the deeper reality. The Allies were caught off guard, humiliated in the opening week, and forced to pay a heavy price for their complacency. Why does the heroic version endure? in part because armies and nations prefer clean victories to uncomfortable truths. Bastogne provided a simple narrative surrounded Americans, refusing to surrender, holding out until relief arrived. It was a story fit for morale in 1944, and it remained useful after the war for shaping public memory. But the costs cannot be ignored. Nearly 90,000 American casualties. Entire divisions shattered, civilians displaced and executed, war crimes on both sides, a battlefield where victory was achieved not through flawless strategy but through superior resources and Germany's inevitable exhaustion. The controversy lies in the contradiction. The Bulge is celebrated as America's finest hour in Europe, yet it was also its bloodiest and most avoidable battle. It revealed that Allied commanders underestimated their enemy, failed to act on intelligence, and allowed Hitler to achieve a breakthrough that should never have been possible. The legacy of the Bulge, then, is not just of triumph. It is a warning. Victory in war is often messier than memory allows. Myths are built to inspire, but history, when told honestly, forces us to confront failure as well as success. The Ardennes was not only Hitler's last gamble, it was also the Allies' last great mistake.